Hello and welcome to the second part of the CertCentral Training Certification Program. In this section, we will look at managing accounts, and we will also look at managing sub-accounts within the CertCentral Management Console. Within account management, we're going to look a little bit at user management, different roles, the different way to assign privileges to roles, and we're going to look at when you invite users, what that looks like. We're also going to look a little bit at divisions and how that works and how you can restrict users to divisions. We're going to talk about guest access and how to give users the ability to provide and to order certificates that are non-CertCentral users. And we're going to look at audit logs and how to view activity within CertCentral. We're also going to look a little bit at sub-accounts. We're going to talk about how to manage a sub-account, and create sub-accounts, and how to view sub-account orders. All right, so here we will now see the elements about account management and sub-accounts and the different features. So I mentioned that we'll have a look at the users, and adding users within CertCentral is really simple and basic, and we've tried to simplify the experience so that it's easy to distinguish between what users and roles and privileges a particular user has and what they have access to. So we can see a couple of information on this page over here. This just gives you an overview of all of the users within CertCentral that have access to the management platform in one form or another. So we'll see some of the basic information relating to the user. So this is just, for instance, the name. Then we see the username. Earlier on in the first module, I spoke about the username and how this has to be unique, and how your email address can be the same across different CertCentral accounts. And here we see the additional note about what kind of role the user has been given. And we also will take a look at divisions. So divisions is basically something that allows CertCentral users or businesses maybe to split up the certificate management activity into kind of different logical parts. And if that is an approach that you want to use, often users want to restrict particular users to particular divisions so that they are limited to functionalities that are only for a particular division. So we'll cover divisions in a bit more in a second in a bit more detail. But as you can see here from this list, we also capture the last login date for a particular user, so that you can see when this user was last active. In the case where there is no login date, this is because this user has never logged in before into the CertCentral account, and therefore their profile is in an inactive state. So within CertCentral, we will see 5 different roles typically. So if I go ahead and I add a user like this, this would be if I was a CertCentral administrator, as an example, and I wanted to go and add someone to CertCentral, I would then have to fill in all of their basic information here. I would then go ahead and add their username. An important sort of distinction is as you're adding your email address, what CertCentral will do is it will automatically populate your username with your email address. So if you fill out your email address, just note that you may need to change this so that it is appropriate to your situation if you already have a user in CertCentral in a different account. So we can see that the job title is a required field if this user is requesting EV certificates. This is because if this CertCentral user that we're adding is also going to be what we call the verified contact, which is something I covered in the first module, then this is a necessary piece of information that we need to capture in order to verify the user. Furthermore, you can see that there's an option here to only allow this user to log in through SAML single sign-on. So this is something that we will cover in the third module in the CertCentral training. But basically what this means is that the CertCentral user that's being added will not be able to log in to the DigiCert CertCentral portal from the login link that I showed in the first part of this training program. It means that they would have to specifically log in through their own what we call identity provider. I'll go into that in a little bit more detail as mentioned, but the point is that they will still access the CertCentral interface, but they will not be able to directly log in like all other users. You can also restrict this user to a specific division, which means that they will be limited to only having access to the features that are applicable within a particular division. And then, of course, now we will define the role that this user will have. So earlier on, I mentioned that there are 5 roles. Whilst it may look like there are only 4, the distinction is this option. So if I have a standard user, this standard user can place orders, they can request revocations or reissues, but any action that they take needs to be approved by either a manager or an administrator. So in this case, they can even see other orders, other standard users' orders, so they have full visibility, but not necessarily full access to everything. If this option is chosen, this is the delineation that makes them the 5th user role type, and that is what we call the limited user. And the limited user is basically the same as the standard user, except they cannot see anyone else's orders other than their own or those that they've specifically been given access to. During the first part of the CertCentral certification program, part 1, I demonstrated how you can assign a particular user to an order, and that action applies to limited users only because all other CertCentral users can see all other orders. So you can see here there's a brief description of each role. So we've got the manager role that can basically approve orders, but they cannot create divisions, and they cannot add other users to the account, something that's restricted to the administrator, with, of course, the administrator having full privileges where they can create divisions and users, and of course it includes all the functionality as above. So if a user is added, as an example, we will add something just to populate the information here. So let's just go ahead and do some test data. We'll just leave the title. Let's say we will leave it as a limited user, and let's say we go ahead and add this user to the portal. Okay, so in this case, we can see that because the email address is the same as the username, let me just go ahead and add something that is unique. All right, let's make that the limited user, and we'll say add user. So as we can see, the user has been added into the users list of the CertCentral page. You can see that the user is here. We can see that there is no login date because this user has been sent the email that they need to complete to create their account. And if they were to complete that, they would then be able to log in, and we would add a timestamp to their login date. In this particular case, the email that the user needs to complete is basically to set up their username and their password and their security question so that their account is unique and their own. In the case where an administrator does not complete the information, and rather he wants to delegate the filling of that information out to someone else, he can simply go and invite other CertCentral users. So in this case, if I wanted to send a invitation email just to someone's email address and have them fill out all their information, I could absolutely do that. I could send a custom message and include that in the body of the email, and perhaps then just choose send invitation. In this case, of course, you can add multiple users at the same time. I'm just adding an individual one. So in this case, you'll see that it says invitation successfully sent. You can view your invitations on the user invitations page. So that takes us down to this page. and we can see that there are a number of users that are pending over here. We can see where it's been sent to, who invited the user, and in this case, these would be CertCentral users. And in this case, the action that I can take is to either cancel the invitation or to resend the invitation. Um, we provide a description here to say, which I just explained, which is that the new user has been sent to the invitee, but they have not filled out the user request form. So if the user were to complete the email that they receive, um, then we would see another type of status within this page, which effectively would require an administrator to approve that user, and you would see that they would need to choose the privilege that that user will be assigned to. So for instance, the user filled out their information, and now the administrator must decide, must this be an administrator user, or does this have to be a manager or a limited user, whatever the particular case warrants. So the next thing we're going to look at is divisions. So divisions are something that is used throughout CertCentral, and perhaps not that visible initially if you haven't created multiple divisions, but they are extensively used. So every single order that is placed within CertCentral belongs to a division. It cannot belong to multiple divisions, it can only belong to one division at a time. And to just quickly give you an indication of what that looks like, I'm now going to come back to the idea of ordering a certificate. In part one of the demo of the training that I did on the CertCentral ordering process, I demonstrated how to complete the form and what the various elements of this form contain. However, the one thing that is worth expanding on at this point is this section over here. So we can see that the point is that when you're requesting a certificate, each order now needs to be associated with the division. And by default, the order will be associated with what we call the parent division, unless a user is restricted to a particular division, in which case, if they are confined to a single division, they will not be able to edit or change this field. Or if they are confined to a small number of divisions, they'll only be able to choose from the divisions to which they have been assigned. In this case, I'm an administrator with no constraints, and thus I can order certificates for any division in this list. So if there was, for instance, a particular division that I wanted to order a certificate for, like let's say in this case, I'm going to choose the division with the name production operations. I would go ahead and place my request as per normal. And I'm just going to collect a CSR to be able to use that in this enrollment form. And if we just go back to the enrollment flow, and I'll just choose production operations. All right, so in this case, this would be the same as placing any regular order with it being tied to this production operations. If I wanted to add additional subject alternative names as an example, I could, provided that the domain is allowed. So in this case, no restrictions, but we're going to go and dig into that in a little bit more now when we look at divisions. So coming back to this page, we'll now see the full list of divisions that are in this account. Again, I'm an administrator with no constraints. If we look, for example, at the different options that we have here, so you can add a new division if that is what you're looking to do. Maybe this is a department that you want to add to a CertCentral account to delegate some of the certificate management functionality. There are various ways in which divisions can be useful. If you, for instance, use account funds and you want to use funds for different divisions, you could absolutely do that. Let's say, for instance, you upload a purchase order and you've uploaded a certain amount of funds in the account, and that's available. You could split that across multiple divisions to delegate not just certificate management, but also the finances between that. So in this case, we're just going to ask for the name of the division, a description, which is maybe like a department name. Um, we also have this option for renewal notifications. So you can have division-specific request renewal notifications. So as an example, if you wanted certificates that belong to a particular division to get renewal notices, you would then enter that here. You could also restrict users to a division, like I mentioned previously, in which case they would only be able to interact with this particular division. Um, And furthermore, you can see here that this gives us the ability to restrict either organizations or domains to a particular division. So if I go, for example, and I choose, well, actually, I just want a specific organization, and let's say I'm going to choose this company over here, and perhaps I want to specify, okay, I'm going to limit this to the domain people.0.za. Important to note that this doesn't just restrict the base domain. So if I was to add, for example, demo.people.co.za, then I would only be able to order any certificate that is a prefix of this specific subdomain. So if I go ahead and were to save this as an example, so we could say, let's say demonstration demo, and I were to click Save Division, and I tried to order a certificate for that particular division. We choose that from the list. So we'll see that CertCentral has parsed the CSR, and we've given a block in this form, which is that people.co.za is not in the list of allowed names for this division. Contact your administrator to update your division settings. So if someone wanted to request a certificate for under this division, they would have to enter at a minimum the subdomain demo. So we could say here, for instance, test as the subdomain that we want, and then we could append the domain name that we want to add to this division. So you'll see in this case, I've now entered this, and CertCentral has allowed that to go through. Again, I may just, for instance, choose my term. The information here would be similar to the previous orders that I've placed in part 1 of this training. And now I can just go ahead and click submit. And then the certificate should go ahead and issue. All right, so now if we go, for instance, to the orders page, we can see that there is division-specific information. All right, so here we see the page. You can see I've just ordered the test.demo.people.co.za certificate. If I drill down directly into the order, we can now see this additional detail, which shows us to which division this order belongs. If I wanted to edit this particular order, I could, for instance, assign this to a different division, and perhaps the one that I showed earlier called production operations. So in this case, I'm just clicking save, and CertCentral is going to reassign that division. So if I wanted to come back to the orders page, and let's say I'm an administrator and I'd like to view the details of a particular division, then I could go ahead and look at well, what are the certificates that are all associated with this particular division called production operations in this case? And we can see that the certificate that I just ordered through the different division is now visible within this particular filter that I've just applied. So divisions are a very important item to understand because they are quite heavily used, and they also allow a person to segment the different ways in which people can order certificates within their account. Also, an interesting little, just a tip, if anyone is trying to change the parent division, which is the relationship between these, so these are the child divisions and these are the parent, you can simply modify this item here, which correlates with this text over here by clicking on My Division and then clicking on Edit Division and then updating the name of the division. All right, so then the next thing that we're going to move on to is we'll just quickly have a look at the audit logs. That should be fairly brief, very straightforward. It's really just a record of all of the key activity that's occurred within CertCentral with regards to all of those things that we flag as items that are important to notify those users that are able to view the audit logs. So there's a couple of items here, but you can see that primarily what we're capturing is obviously the date of the action, the user. In this case, we can see that I've moved the order from this division to that division. It captures the IP address, and of course the country over here is based on the IP address, and it shows the division to which the order initially belonged. You can also set up audit log notifications. So if, for example, you had wanted to create a specific notification that notifies someone about a particular event, you could set up that single rule. So maybe I wanted to know more about, for instance, user logins that apply to all divisions and not just my own. And I could use this email address as the email address that I'd like to use in that notification. And you can see we've now gone ahead and created another rule, which is that this email address will be sent all security notifications about user logins. This one already exists, which is whenever someone revokes a certificate within CertCentral, this email address will automatically receive emails saying that this activity has occurred. So moving on to the next piece, which is guest access. So guest access is the feature that allows users to access CertCentral without, it allows them to place orders without actually being able to log into CertCentral. And the workflow there is dependent on administrators approving orders placed through this guest access feature. And so it's broken up into two parts. So the first part of that is what we call the guest URL. So the guest URL allows someone to place a order for a brand new certificate. So that could be, for instance, if I wanted to add a guest URL, I could enter the name of the guest URL, note that a guest URL is tied to a specific division. So if there was particular constraints, again, we can choose, for instance, this production operations division. If there was particular constraints that apply to a division, we could now have that also apply, for example, to the guest URL, so that you can prevent users from placing orders on a public URL for domains that you don't want them to order certificates for. Of course, you can also choose the language. You can also choose the different types of certificates. So in this case, let's say we want to restrict that just to the secure site OV a product, and we could limit that to, like, for instance, a particular term. Um, so there's also some additional information available on the guest URL. So if there was, for instance, contract information, you could and pricing, you could display that on the transaction summary of the guest URL page. If there's any uncertainty into what a particular feature does, I always recommend clicking this little modal with a question mark, which will then describe precisely what the information will do. So we also see this section about domains, hide existing domains. So you'll note when I demonstrate the guest URL in a few moments that the domains, unless checked, are going to be visible to all users. So if there's a concern about the security of your account, whereby you're exposing through a public URL all the domains that are available for certificates in your account, then a user would definitely want to check this to hide that information. So you can also hide domain control validation methods. You might have a scenario where users are requesting certificates for domains that they do not own, and perhaps you do not want them to be able to be the ones that choose how to validate these domains. So we can also see organizations. If you want users to only select from existing organizations to prevent them from creating either misspelled organizations or organizations that are not meant to be authenticated in this account, you can limit that down in further detail. As well as you can add the option to expand additional certificate options, which is one of the options when ordering a certificate, to kind of just show in a more prominent fashion a user for how they can select the server platform and some of the other options associated, some of the other customization associated with a certificate. In this case, I'm just going to go ahead and grab an existing guest URL. So you can see that I've previously created this. The language, for instance, here, let's say is English. This is the name. These are the products. And you can see that I've chosen various options over here. And I'll just say save guest URL. And now we're going to have a look at placing the actual request for the guest URL. I'm just going to go ahead and make sure that I've copied the correct URL over here. And let's go to, for instance, Mozilla Firefox. In this case, you have to, if you would like to test the CertCentral browser and you want to test, for instance, guest access, you cannot be logged into CertCentral and access this URL at exactly the same time. So it's important that you make that distinction between the session that the browser is using. In this case, you can see that there's the language, and I've just now changed it to English, so it was in French. You can see the different types of products listed here. And in this case, I'm just going to go ahead and click order now. So in this case, I might just add my information. Let's say that I'm a requester. Maybe I'm part of a large organization, or there's a scenario where I'm a third party that needs a certificate. I can enter my information into this portal. I'm just going to grab the CSR. And we'll see I'm going to choose the domain name that I want a certificate for. Again, I can choose the coverage option that is something that suits my needs. I can choose the issuing CA, the signature hash, the platform. Here are all of the different extended key usages that I spoke about in part one that can be added onto a certificate, and the organization that will be associated with the certificate. For guest URL orders, I highly recommend that users always consider which other emails they would like to add onto the order, because as I will demonstrate in a moment, the guest access feature requires an additional email or the email address of the organization contact or the technical contact to access a guest access order. So in this case, I'm just going to go ahead and place this request for a simple certificate, again through the guest URL. Now it will indicate your request has been successfully created and is now pending an approval by an administrator to your account. So we'll indicate the order number, but very importantly, um, any order that's placed through a guest URL always has to be reviewed and approved by either a manager or an administrator. So if we go back to CertCentral, we'll be able to see um, that this order is now reflected under the requests queue. In part one, I demonstrated how any order that requires approval will be placed into the requests queue. We can see the request that I just placed. The status is needs approval. If I interact with this order, we can see a number of things. One is we add this message to say this request was submitted through the guest URL and not by an authenticated user. And this is why, because it's a public URL, all orders need to be approved. An administrator can see all of the information relating to the request. So number one, we have the user. We can see the division to which this guest URL belongs. We can see all the information that's associated with the order, and the custom fields that will be tied to this order can also be modified. However, very importantly, an administrator can also edit an order that has been placed by a guest URL user. And that can include anything from changing the division to changing the CSR, and ultimately any option that the user was originally able to choose is something that they can now modify. In this case, I will not modify the order. I will just go ahead and approve it as is, and that will then go ahead and issue the certificate. So if we we'll see once we approve the order, that shows as approved, and then we're just going to go ahead and issue that. So you can see there it's approved. If I go back to the orders page, we can see that the order that I placed is immediately issued. And this is because both the organization and the domain combination has previously been approved. The next thing that we will look at is the guest access feature. And guest URL is meant for new orders, and guest access is meant for an existing order. So if you would like to access an existing order, there's another URL. In this case, it is always the same. It's not going to be different like in the case of a guest URL. And there are several settings that you can choose to use to interact with the URL. So that could include the organization contact, the technical contact, their email address that can be used to access the order. It could be the original person that requested a certificate, meaning the guest URL requester. So if they requested the new certificate and now at some stage they're looking to renew it. Also the additional emails, and for revocation requests through the guest URL, this option basically says whether or not those revocation requests require administrator approval. So that is something that's different from in CertCentral, where there is that double approval that's required. In this case, if need be, then a single revocation request can be automatically approved through the guest URL. This depends on the organization's preference. So we'll quickly show you how to basically access these orders via the guest access before moving on to subaccounts. So in this case, I will take either the order number, or we could, for instance, look at the common name, and then access the guest access platform. Again, much like the first one, you have to use a different browser because the sessions will unfortunately clash. So here we see the guest access portal. So this is different from what you may have previously seen. And we're just going to go ahead and enter the email address. So again, this could be the email address of additional users or the organization or the technical contact. And let's go ahead and just enter the domain name that I just entered. So if I click continue now, we see that I will get a code that's going to be sent to me directly, and the code is something that I will need to enter. So this page requires the authentication code, which I have just retrieved from the email that was sent to me, and I will go ahead and use that to validate access to the order. Once I've entered this information, you can see that the platform is going to allow me access to all of the orders that in some form or another I have access to. In this case, I searched for the common name as displayed here, and there are many different orders that I have placed that match this common name, and therefore I get to choose which order I want to modify. If I go, for instance, to this particular order, then there are very similar actions available to me, much like you would have for an existing order that you could modify if you were a CertCentral user, except in this case, it's limited very specifically just to this one order. So you can see that if someone needs to reissue a certificate, they could do that. Maybe they want to go and add additional subject alternative names, or maybe they need a duplicate, or maybe they need to revoke it or simply retrieve the certificate. They have all of these basic options and functions available to them, and thus they have everything that they need to manage the order that they've placed through the guest URL. If they want to access an order that's been previously placed only in CertCentral, then that's also something that can be done. The only requirement there is that when you're going into a particular order in CertCentral, you need to be able to ensure that the option enable guest access has been enabled. The next item of this section of this training that we're going to be covering is subaccounts. So subaccounts are a good way for businesses to further decentralize certificate management. Um, Divisions is a way of already separating out some duties and some privileges, but subaccounts go to kind of the next level, which is it creates a brand new CertCentral account with its own users, its own certificates, its own validation information. So if, for example, you wanted to issue certificates in a subaccount, um, then that validation information would not be inherited from the parent account, which is the account that I'm currently logged into. So as an example, if I wanted to um, issue that certificate, I would need to first validate the information in the sub account because it is treated completely separately. There are some features and functionality available to the parent account that can influence the sub account to an extent that there is a level of control over the sub account. So on this page, we can see here is an existing list of sub accounts that have been previously created. So in a similar sense to how we invited users to an account, um, versus creating a user and adding them ourselves, this functionality is also available for sub-accounts. So I could, for instance, simply invite another, I could send an email address, for instance, and send that directly to someone who will then receive a form where they can fill out the organization information and their own information, user information as it relates to this new account effectively that they're going to be creating. And um, CertCentral subaccounts also has different types of subaccounts. So there are 4 in total, but 3 that you can see. So the different types of subaccount are what we call the retail or basic subaccount. We get the enterprise subaccount, and then of course we get the reseller or partner type subaccount, depending on the use case. Now, there is a 4th one which is not visible here, and that is because it is called a managed subaccount, and it is only available via our API. Um, when you as an administrator, for example, either create a subaccount or you invite a user to create a subaccount, that user will in both cases receive an email and require them to at a minimum set up their own user profile, which again includes creating a password and the sensitive information. Um, the user does not directly have access to placing orders in the subaccount and more detailed information. However, with a managed subaccount through the API, the parent account immediately has access to the subaccount by getting an API key that will act as a username and password to that account. That is effectively the distinction between these four different types of subaccounts. In this case, let's go ahead and work through the flow of creating a subaccount to show you what that looks like. So as I previously mentioned, you have different subaccount types, um, and you have this option of account manager. An account manager can be any CertCentral user, and the use case here is if so standard users don't have access to the subaccounts tab, but you could assign a standard user as the account manager, in which case they would be able to have access to the subaccounts tab, and they'd be able to see those subaccounts to which they have been assigned as the account manager. If that scenario applies, then this is what that feature is for, but it is optional. So we can see the rest of the information here entails filling out the contact information. This is what we call the subaccount contact, and this would be the very first CertCentral user in the subaccount. Again, we also require an organization name that at the very minimum will be added into the subaccount. It will not be automatically submitted for validation, but it is present there because it will be ready for someone to, at a minimum, start ordering certificates, provided that they first do the validation of that organization. These are the general components of a CertCentral account, but earlier on I'd mentioned that there's additional functionality that a parent account has over a subaccount. And this is really related to the billing as well as the products that are available to the subaccount. This is the level of control that is available. And we can see some information in this case. So we see bill subaccount. This really means that DigiCert is going to be billing the subaccount very plainly. In this case, when the customer is the primary organization that is assigned to this account, and so this is this option is basically saying bill the parent account rather than the subaccount for any orders that have been placed in the subaccount. The option over here basically allows you to toggle between whether or not the subaccount itself is able to create subaccounts and what the billing will be like with regards to those subaccounts. So that's kind of a very important distinction, because if it's not if the parent account does not want the sub account, or perhaps the grandchild account, because that is the maximum relationship between subaccounts, they can choose this option, and that will mean that the grandchild account's orders will be billed against the parent account, the grandparent account, which is the master account, the first one, or alternatively that it must pay for all of its own orders, and it must not be associated with the parent account. So with subaccounts, there are three levels. There's the parent account, the child account, which in this case, because I am the parent account, I would be creating the child subaccount. And if this child subaccount created its own subaccount, that would be considered the grandchild subaccount or the subaccount. You can also toggle the subaccount spending limits. Again, I mentioned that there's this, of course, this billing component. So unlimited means that they can place as many orders as they would like with no restrictions, whereas limited might be for them to set a negative balance limit on the subaccount's spending. So for example, if they added 2,000 euros or $2,000, depending on the currency that they want to choose, it means that the account would only be able to allow to spend that amount of dollars or euros before there would be a block in place. So the important thing to note around all of this is that The idea here is really to control the expenditure of the sub account, but everything here is um, just vanity content in the sense that um, the spending has no effect or bearing on the parent account. This is just for the sub account. Um, you can also use the default sort of price that the DigiCert is charging, or if there's a customization level that needs to rather be displayed, such as no pricing, because that's not a requirement for the sub account, that can be chosen. Um, in addition, if the sub account is using the multi-year plan, you can also choose if that must be limited. Perhaps there is going to be a restriction where you don't want any multi-year plan orders, in which case you can just restrict that to a 1 year. And of course, here we can see that all of these products are um, activated by default, and they can be individually deselected if need be. These products that are visible in the parent account will only be visible based on whether or not the parent account has these products activated. In other words, if there are only a handful of products activated for the parent account, then the child or sub account will only be able to have the same option of products or less available to them. The other items are, it's also possible to see um, for sub-account orders, what orders that have been placed in the sub-account. So we can see here that we've provided the order number. We also show the sub-account, and we show the name of the sub-account, and then in brackets, the organization that's associated with that sub-account. We show the product, whether or not price is a factor, when it was ordered, and what the status is. If there is a scenario where the currency of the sub-account has been set to rather use units rather than a currency, for instance, then that is something that you'd be able to, for instance, view within this page. One thing to note also for sub-accounts is that you could go and review the sub-account information, and you can make changes to existing sub-accounts. So as an example, if I chose this account, the one that I demonstrated under sub-account orders, there is a level of visibility into the sub-account. So you can see that this is effectively a summary of the sub-account. You can see which products have been enabled for the sub-account. You can also see which organizations have been added into the sub-account, and whether or not they're validated. And of course, then you can see which domains have been added into the sub accounts and the company, and whether or not they have been validated. So this might be key information for the parent account, but again, the idea is that the point of sub accounts is to decentralize the certificate management. Thank you very much, and this concludes part 2 of the CertCentral training certification program.